The TzHaar World Series has just been announced, and with that means a lot of people are trying to learn how to Inferno speedrun. Thankfully, I've got a guide out, and while it covers most of the major tactics and strategies used in speedrunning, half a year's passed and times and gear are kinda getting out of date now. So I'm here to give you the full update and catch you up to speed so you can turn from that first caper into one of the best speedrunners out there. I'll also be giving you tips that I didn't cover in the first guide that I think a lot of new runners miss. Before we get started, I need to clarify. This video updates my original guide and adds some further detail, but it does not cover the basics and the fundamentals. Those are in my original guide, so if you don't know the basics, this video isn't going to be all that helpful by itself. At its core, the fundamentals that are in the original guide are still way more important. So if you haven't already, go watch the original guide. You don't have to see the whole thing, it's got a table of contents and it's split into segments specifically so you can skip to the parts that you need to work on. Because if you're just starting out, that video's got a lot more of the details that you're going to want compared to this one. So let's start with updating time thresholds and gear setups. I'm going to flash the newer gear setups on screen so you can see what's changed in the past 6 months. You can pause if you want a closer look, but basically, Missouri is a huge DPS increase, so the difficulty level before and after Raids 3 will be reflected in these new time thresholds. This means that some of the tips I gave you for sections like sub 52 might be more applicable to like sub 50 times now, and some of the tips that I gave for sub 50 might be more important for something like sub 47 or sub 45 even. This means that you should really pay attention to the sections around your time threshold, even if you're technically faster than them. Right now you could easily sub 50, but still need a lot of practice with sections in the sub 52 part of the guide. Essentially, just be sure you're not ignoring fundamental skills just because your time has gotten past a threshold. Now we're going to talk basic tips that I didn't have time to cover in the main guide. These should help fine-tune your play if it's a little rough around the edges. So if a melee spawns in the center and a monster spawns in the northeast, they will attack you on the same tick. This means that this is one spawn that you have to immediately run north or else you'll chance a hit. Every other spawn will actually give you an opportunity to flick them, so if you see this, don't panic. Similarly, if there's a ranger or blob combo with one of them northeast, you always pray against the blob one tick after the dominant NPC. So let's say ranger spawns center, blob spawns northeast, you pray against the ranger, and one tick after the next time he hits you, you pray against the blob. If the ranger spawns northeast, then you watch the ranger, time he attacks you, pray against the blob here. These scenarios are semi-uncommon, but keeping an eye out for them will on average save you a lot of health throughout a full run. Many spawns will have a melee trapped northeast of the north pillar. 99% of the time, you have to take a step south and untrap this immediately. New and intermediate runners love leaving it trapped because it's safe, but that actually leaves you vulnerable to many risks later on in the wave. It is almost never a good play. If you're playing fast, you need this melee untrapped so it can follow you to a more high priority monster. You need it so you can chin it on mini blobs, or you might need it so you can body block bats to save run energy. And most of all, you're not going to have to worry about it digging or it being the last monster alive. So many runners I see will leave it trapped and then go to hit something else. The next thing you know, the ranger's on 5 HP and now the melee is digging. Not only did you kill the melee last, you also wasted ticks waiting for the dig animation, and you lost ticks because you didn't sight the ranger on good HP. Pretty much every time I see someone do this, they lose at least 4 ticks in the wave because the melee digs at an inconvenient time. 9 out of 10 times you have to untrap this immediately. The only time you don't is when staying where you are right now isn't a problem even without the melee in the first place. So in this example, I can hit the mage from here. That means I don't really have to move yet, I can just untrap the melee whenever I want to get closer to the blobs. And in this example, I'm currently busy flicking the mage, the blobs, and killing the bats. I don't need to throw a melee on top of that right now, I'll just kill these bats first and then I can move the melee. Otherwise, you almost always want to untrap this melee instantly. In the sub 55 section on pre-movement, I taught you that you could hit 6 of the 9 possible spawns without losing any ticks on wave start if you had a blowpipe and proper pre-movement. This is true for rangers and blobs, but for NPCs that walk towards you, you can actually blowpipe the melee immediately from all 9 spawns and the bat from the southeast spawn. This means most of the time you shouldn't have to chin any bats or melees immediately off spawn unless they're in a clump. This increases your DPS and helps you get to the pillar a lot quicker, making this a useful tool for many of the waves before 35. Leaving nibblers and bats alive is a very underrated tactic for speedrunners using chins, and I feel like it wasn't emphasized as much as it should have been in the original guide. Nibblers that are close to blobs can be great to leave alive so you can hit them during the pop. Even on a wave like Mage plus Blob, usually you kill the Mage first, but it's very common to see new runners wipe out the nibblers even if it'd be beneficial not to. This is the same on the north pillar. If a ranger is stuck on the north pillar, there's no way for me to get to the north side to drag everything in without losing ticks. But when there's a nibbler alive or a bat walking towards you, you can easily just blowpipe them in between and then drag everything in. This is especially useful if you're not using a scythe yet. Essentially, you want to be conscious and actively thinking about how you can use the nibblers later in the wave instead of just wiping them out instantly every time. Similarly, the original guide also needed to put more emphasis on throwing a blowpipe chin during the blob pop if you're only slightly out of range. In scenarios where you're only just outside blowpipe range, blowpipe chin gives you enough mobility to reclump the minis without losing any ticks, whereas throwing a single chin, you lose a tick on the blob animation, you lose another tick because you can't chin them the same tick that they spawn, and on top of that, the chin that you threw probably hit like a 7. If double blowpiping during a blob death is a 10 out of 10 play, then single chin is like 3.5 out of 10. And then blowpipe chin is probably like 7 or 7.5. Sometimes you do have to single chin, but if you have the choice, you should try and put yourself in situations where you can do better. Once you're more advanced and deep into the sub 50 threshold, you're going to find more ways to set up melee blob chins. But sometimes this can involve flicking and you'll take a lot of damage or risk with it. So here's a spot that helps severely reduce the risk of one of these spawns. West Blob works really well because if you target the melee mini, it'll chin all the nibblers on the west pillar and the minis and the melee that's lured onto you. But standing in this specific spot is optimal because any NPC trapped around the north side of the pillar can't actually see you here because you're out of range by exactly one tile. This means that if you're standing one tile too close, the ranger will still be able to see you. And if you take too many steps south, the ranger will untrap from the north pillar and then begin to attack you. By standing on this exact tile, you can ignore the ranger that's trapped on the north pillar and just focus on the mini blobs and the melee. So if you're aiming for the fastest tier of Inferno speedrunning, you probably want a sub 45 completion ranging down to sub 43 for top level runners. Obviously, to get this fast, a large part of it can boil down to luck, but ideally you should have a list of skills to help reduce the importance of luck as much as possible. Now obviously, to do this you should master all the skills in the previous sections, but I've identified 3 major factors that separate the plays of someone who's above 45 minutes or below 45 minutes. The first skill can broadly be described as reacting. Anyone can get easy spawns and technically miss 0 ticks, but you won't get that luck for an entire run, and if you do, it's not going to come very often. Reaction is what turns a bad situation into a decent one and an okay situation into a great one. In the previous guide, I've already given you the basics of reacting. This refers to knowing what HP to scythe at, stepping under mages after a scythe to stop a revive, blowpiping out of clump mini blobs before you chin the mage and range stack, and pre-moving into scythe distance. Now is where you need to focus on always being ready to do this. If you have a bat and a mini left, someone who's 46 minutes might blowpipe the melee, then blowpipe the bat, and then scythe it afterwards. If you're sub 45, you should be expected to position yourself so you can insta-scythe the bat as soon as the melee dies. If you can't get in position to easily clump the blobs, react to it by blowpiping the melee and then chinning the stack afterwards. Or maybe you chin the range when you can't get far enough east to clump them all with the mage. And sometimes the melee only clumps with the mage 2 ticks after the pop. Doing any of these is so much better than just chinning the mage in range and then dragging the melee with a blowpipe. Reaction turns these terrible situations into something that's really pretty decent. And if you can do this for a full run, then it's going to add up immensely. If a ranger's on 40 HP, it's so easy to just blowpipe scythe it. but that's almost a guaranteed 2-tick loss, because guess what? Your 3 or 4-way scythe was probably going to kill it on 40 HP anyway. This means you have to constantly stare at your XP drops, ready to react, because if you blowpipe a 2 instead of a 20, you can't just scythe it on 60 HP, you're not going to hit that. And now you're standing there doing nothing for 3 seconds. Reaction is the key to getting the most out of your situation, but it's hard to do for the whole run because you have to be paying attention and you can't get tilted and you can't just be dozing off. Always be ready to scythe at the right HP. Always be ready to pre-move if this dies, or to prayer flick it if it doesn't die. If you want to play fast, then you should always be ready to react if things don't go your way. I've already taught you how to do most clumps, same way I've taught you the basics of reacting, but to consistently go fast, clumping melee specifically needs to be a regular occurrence. It's not good enough to just not miss ticks anymore. Blowpiping a whole melee can eat away at your time, so whenever you have the opportunity to clump, you should at least try for it. This is why flicking the melee even with a mage and a blob can be very useful if you want to keep a melee in its current position. This also means how you allocate your clumps matters. Melees have more defense than bats, so if I have a choice to clump nibblers with bats or to clump nibblers with melees, you're gonna get more mileage from killing the bat and then chinning the melee instead. In the same way, bats can frequently get in the way of your clumps, and you'll see in these clips that the bats are actually blocking the melee from getting close to me and the clump that I'm planning. This means you should try and clear out the obstacles first so they don't get in the way of your clump. Keep an eye out for this because the last thing you want is to pop the blob early and now you're tanking a bat in 3 minis. You lose 40 HP to the minis and you end up not getting the clump anyway. Don't let bats block the road and don't pop your blobs early. Blowpiping the melee a little bit is usually a good option if you don't want to pop your blobs prematurely. Now in the same way that you choose your clumps, you should also choose what to spec. At the sub 45 level, you can probably take claws as an extra spec weapon whenever you have high HP. But what you choose to spec matters. You can claw 77 in a 3-way and you can claw an 84 in a 4-way. This means you can literally one-hit a melee, and you can almost consistently blowpipe claw and then scythe finish rangers. What this means is the higher HP you claw at, it's usually the better. Claws also have more impact on melees since they have higher defense than the ranger. So in an ideal scenario, you only ever claw melees at full HP, since any damage done before that is potentially lost DPS. This can make it really hard to use though, since 4-way clawing a melee and then flicking monsters without losing any ticks can be very difficult. So if it comes down to it, clawing rangers is a decent compromise. Ideally, try to save spec before double melee waves so you can dump specs on them for your maximum time save. If you find yourself at full spec during the early waves, it's also a decent solution to claw a blob if there's nothing else alive. When taking a sub 45 setup, you might end up swapping your brew in a range pot for a phoenix necklace to gain an extra switch. The P-neck is pretty easy to use on Zuck, simply try and flick it in between bow hits during the healers and it should heal you once you hit low HP. Just keep in mind that with limited divines and no range pot, you should try and mitigate bat drain since you will only have 45 minutes of divine range potion, and falling below 110 range will lose you multiple max hits on your T-bow. Those are most of the major changes and improvements during these past 6 months. If you can master these skills along with the fundamentals in the original guide, sub 45 and honestly even sub 44 should come relatively quickly. But even if you're not looking to play at that level yet, I hope you could learn something from some of the miscellaneous tips that I've provided. There's still another 2 weeks in the TzHaar World Series, and I'm looking forward to seeing who wins the fastest climber and most improved prizes. So if you're running, good luck to all the runners, and let me know if there were any topics you wanted to know about in the comments section below. TzHaar World Series on March 19th, we'll see you there.